for making time. And I want to thank the members of the Budget and Appropriations Committee of the National Assembly who are just right here. We are a committee of 27 members from across the political divide, because budget making process, we make the budget for our country. And therefore, it is a committee that is very compact, as you can see, with very able members of parliament. I also want to thank our brothers and sisters who are also here in this room from the media. The work we do as representatives of the people would be handicapped a great deal without the collaboration that we always have with the media, not specifically to report what we want, but to report what is there. And we want to commend you for always being very forthright in communicating to the people of Kenya what is there, whether it is convenient for us or not, because that is how a strong modern state should operate. We called you here because we are in the process of making our budget for the financial year 2024-2025. The budget that gets read in June starts its work pretty earlier. The budget that starts to operate in July 1st starts to be made the previous year way before. This budget that you are making started its process in the last calendar year. Should have been around November, where the country is divided into 10 sectors. Those compact sectors which are related then go to something we call sector working groups, where they start now sharing the resources that are there in an objective manner. We then actually have public participation of the Kenyan people coming together to, or coming around the table to give their views. That we already did. But the process of public participation doesn't end there, because even tomorrow we'll be meeting key stakeholders in the budget making process. Just the same thing we did actually on Monday, so that we enrich the process by benefiting from the experiences and knowledge of Kenyans whom this budget belongs to. The budget, what we are doing now in this, or what we'll be doing in this week, and hopefully to conclude next week on Wednesday, when we eventually table this report on the floor and pass it, is something we call BPS. BPS is Budget Policy Statement, which highlights the policies of government, but also with commensurate ceilings of expenditure, so that that expenditure then, the ceilings, will inform the estimates that we'll be working on around April. So it's a very important process, because the budget that will eventually be read is the figures that we are discussing today. This budget that we are doing is a budget of 4.143 trillion shillings. And being a budget of 4.143 trillion shillings, we are envisioning to raise this money from ordinary revenue, which are basically taxes, to a tune of 2.94 trillion shillings. After that, we envision to have what we call CFS. What we call A in A, sorry. A in A, let me just repeat, that the ordinary revenue will be around 2.94 trillion shillings, which is the ordinary revenue that we raise in terms of taxes. Number two is something we call A in A. Appropriations in A is around 486 billion shillings. A in A is the monies that the government collects after offering service through various MDAs. For example, when you pay a university which is public school fees, that school fees becomes A in A for that MDA. We also expect grants of around 49 billion. And lastly, then if you add the math, you'll see that for it to add up to 4.143 trillion, then there is a gap of 703 billion shillings. And that is what is the deficit for this financial year. That is on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, we have had a slight increase in development expenditure, which now stands at around 853.9 billion shillings. As usual, the current expenditure for the executive is also quite high, which is around 2.511 trillion shillings. And this expenditure incorporates also the judiciary and the legislature, which is parliament or bunge. And then from there, we'll be giving our counties also quite substantially, around 391 billion shillings. And then we have something we call CFS, Consolidated Fund Services, which this year we have increased to among the highest figures we've ever given, to over 1.2 trillion Kenya shillings. The reason we are doing this is because we also want to continue offsetting our debts in a timely manner so that the stability of our country in terms of the macros can be guaranteed. Just a side thing I want to say about the deficit. The deficit of this financial year is climbing down. You remember, if you check the books, the current budget that we're implementing for 23-24 financial year had a deficit of around 886 billion shillings. That is on the current revised printed budget after the supplementary. We are bringing that much lower to 703. And the critical part, which I'm very proud of for this committee, is that the last deficit to GDP ratio of this country was 5.5%. The current one we are defending meaning we are working against, is 3.9%. That is quite modest, and especially it's quite manageable, and especially if you look at our peers, both in the emerging economies and in the developing economies, and not the economies in the southern part. And therefore, this is very commendable that we are continuing to lessen our appetite for debt budgeting, and eventually, I am sure at some point, we will be able to reach a balanced budget where we rely squarely on our resources. Some of the key highlights maybe just to mention is that the budget, if you look at the last supplementary and the current, we have just marginally increased our budget, marginally. If you look at the expenditures in the previous times, the budget usually goes up by a double digit. But if you look at this time, the budget is growing very marginally, because we do not want to read budgets that then remain in books. We want to do a budget that actually gets implemented. And that is why we are looking inwards to manage our expenditure so that the budgeted expenditure actually happens. In the previous past, we have seen robust budgets being read, but eventually what gets implemented is a percentage of that, and especially due to exchequer problems. And that is why the approach for this year is fiscal consolidation, so that we do a real budget, a budget that reflects the revenue that we anticipate to get, so that eventually it actually gets implemented. Some of the issues, we are adding money into health, we are adding money into very few sectors this time, because as I said, we are doing fiscal consolidation. We are adding 9 billion shillings to health sector, basically because that is an area that is very critical to us. We are also adding some resources into environment, and we are adding resources to other critical areas around better or bottom-up economic transformation agenda. If you look, there are some budgets, and I have also seen you have captured them in your outlets. There are also some budgets that we have rationalized because of the situation and also the absorption. That is why you see in some areas the budget has slightly gone lower, but doesn't mean that those areas do not need resources. Those areas need resources, but we are trying to moderate because we are working against a deficit that is we must look and work against. As I come to the close, I want to thank the members of this committee and all the members of Parliament out of the policies that we continue to make, including the policies we made last year, and especially given the fact that budget actually becomes law, so it's also a policy. Our country, Kenya, I know there is room for improvement in terms of the economy. But the truth of the matter is that Kenya last year, out of the budget that we made and the other policies of government, Kenya grew by around 5.6% last financial year. Actually, last calendar year, sorry. And therefore, that made Kenya among the 28 fastest growing economies in the world. It doesn't mean we are just stamping and we are saying things are very good. It means at least the policies we put in place are bearing fruit. But also that then calls us to do even more. Why? I shouldn't be telling Kenyans that GDP grew. Kenyans should be feeling it in their pockets. And that is the exact thing that we are doing in this budget, to reallocate our resources in areas that will guarantee Kenyans shared prosperity, where most of the Kenyans will actually feel the growth. I want to assure Kenyans that is why we are here for a week. We'll be here next week because the policies we are making, we want the farmers of this country to feel the economy, those with small businesses to feel the economic growth, so that this eventually translates into shared prosperity. Lastly, I also want to say that we have seen some quite improvement in our currency. I'm saying these things because they are all related to the budget. As we are aware, our shilling is now doing very well in comparative to the other world currencies. And we expect it to do further, better further. We are expecting some inflows. We have seen increment in remittances. There are some resources we are expecting from our development partners, and we are sure that Kenya shillings will continue to gain ground. Because once we let our Kenya shilling actually operate on the basis of market forces of demand and supply, then the country do not need to use any expenditure in stabilizing our currency. Those resources that we then put as reserves can actually be expended to other areas. And that is why market economy, or a perfectly competitive economy, in all the markets, the market of money, the market of interest rates, the market of commodities and services, always works for an efficient economy. Efficient markets generally and ultimately brings efficiencies to the economy. And I am happy that across all those markets, things are doing well. Inflation is doing well. In terms of now, we are at 6.6%. The last reported, our currency is gaining ground. These things happen because of good policies, some of which I'm proud that this Budget and Appropriations Committee is at the center of those policies. Kuna any clarification? Yes. Na tukifanya hayo ni vizuri tuseme tumesikia kilio cha Wakenya wengi ambao wamepata kazi kutoka huko nje. Na wakipata kazi inakuwa ni shida sana kupata passport. Na katika hii process tunafanya, tumeongeza shilingi bilioni 3 katika immigration services, kwa sababu tunataka wakuwe up to date with the equipment they need, kwa sababu tunataka passports za Wakenya zikuwe processed in time so that they can take advantage of the many opportunities that a passport is integral to. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
My name is John Chacha from K24 TV. I have about 3 questions. One, while the National Treasury released the BPS 2024, it was termed by pundits as an ambitious one. Factoring in the fiscal deficit, which is a primary driver of debt, with now it being at 703 billion Kenya shillings, already KRA has missed its targets by 200 billion as of now. Are we likely to see a situation that we'll have to borrow more in order to finance the next budget, which has crossed the 4 trillion mark? 2, the National Treasury contradicted itself on the BPS and also the medium-term debt management strategy on the mixing ratio, that is the optimal mixing ratio of domestic and external debt. In one, actually in the BPS, it says that it will borrow 377 billion domestically and the rest externally, whereas in the debt management strategy, it's stated that it's going to borrow more externally unlike domestically. So at what ratio is that going to stand at? And of course, its implications, whether it will be more domestic debt, of course, to the economy, factoring in the CPR rate and the access of the MSMEs to the credit. Finally, the Auditor General raised a concern of this whole budget process being more of a mockery process, with 1.6 trillion having been, of course, added in the last 9 years as in form of supplementary budgets. Also, I think the last year, it was the end of last year, it was an additional budget. Address that and also the misuse of Article 233, the Kenya Kwanza government having borrowed over 200 billion in 5 months.
Just to piggyback right on what Chacha has just said, you back say from TV 47 on debt management and of course keeping up with the increasing debt by the Kenya Kwanza government. You had said that one of the anchors would be as a percentage of the GDP and not for the debt ceiling. What's the progress on this? And also the value of the currency. You've said, of course, remittance will be increasing. In what sense? How exactly is the volatility of the shilling being handled right now?
Maybe we can handle those, then we can take a few more. First of all, thank you very much, George. And
Joel.
Sorry, Joel. Yeah. Chacha. Thank you very much. Must be from Korea. Yeah. I can see you MP now. Kadari.
Yes, both actually.
Very good. Thank you very much. Joel, Chacha. And he back from TV 47. I want to say that this budget is actually one of the most modest in terms of, if you look at the previous budgets, there has always been an increment of around 10% to the previous budget. The increment of this budget is just shy of around 100 billion shillings, based on the last printed or the last updated budget after incorporating supplementary 2 of in 23-24, supplementary 1, sorry. And therefore, I don't think that is a good accusation that it is ambitious. And number 2, also, in terms of deficit, Jordan, if you look at the figures, this financial year that we are now exiting had a deficit of 886 billion shillings. We are walking the talk that we need to emancipate our budget making process from the resources of other people so that we budget with what we have. But that process is gradual. And that is why we are already climbing down in a huge manner. We have already shed off a deficit of over 100 and around 80 billion shillings comparative to last year. That's a good step in the right direction. The other issue is on debt and the mix. What there is that, Joel, you know, when you're managing an economy, you're managing a moving vehicle. All the variables you're dealing with are moving, they are not static. That is why Treasury always have the latitude to make adjustments. And the more the reason we actually even do supplementary budgets. The current mix that we want as a country is a mix that reflects our current debt. Our current debt is around 50-50 in terms of foreign and domestic. It is more or less the same. However, the most ideal one is where we lean more into getting resources outside more than inside. Because when we get resources from outside, then we do not fall into a temptation of crowding out business people out of our financial industry. And that is the reason why Treasury are looking more into fetching more monies outside, because there are many reasons. One, we get competitive rates, but also number 2, will leave the resources that are domestic to be borrowed by our private sector, and I think they are working towards that. Then, on Article 223, the beauty about even the questions that I've had, I think the people in here are all economists, even from the media. That's very good because you challenge us to also project the right things. Article 223, if you check, the most disabused period is the last 1 year. If you check the invocation of Article 223, the amount of money spent for the last 1 year is the least we could remember. And it's a deliberate decision that we have made as the budget committee, and we have also talked about it with the executive. That Article 223 will always be invoked when it must. And that is why we have seen a huge decrease in the amount of money that is expended at Article 223. Lastly, the one for HII is the issue of debt and GDP ratio. You know, in all progressive economies, including the US, even the reporting of debt, if you check in all economic channels, you'll rarely see any debt in absolute terms, because economies are relative. The economy of Kenya is relative to Tanzania, is relative to the US. So if you report compact figures without referencing the GDP, then you will not be communicating properly. And that is why even as a country, we came up with a debt anchor, because an absolute figure does not speak to in relative to what. But debt to GDP ratio speaks to, this is the size of the economy, and that is why we are borrowing this. If you look at the US, their debt currently is around 1.4 trillion US dollars. But it's relative to what? Their GDP. So that then, their debt to GDP ratio comes at around maybe 105% or thereabout. In Kenya, our debt to GDP ratio could be maybe in the regions of shy of around 70%. And some would argue, but you say it is about 55%. That is a target, and it had a timeline that within the next 5 years, we try to balance our debt. We try to consolidate our debt, that is domestic and foreign, as a share of GDP at 55% or below. Of course, with a band of 5% upwards. And therefore, I think it's a good thing to have an anchor more than an absolute figure. The other one you talked about remittances. You know, economics is based on projections, and it is based on all the other parameters. When you look at currency, the issue was about currency and remittances. I think if I got the question right. Currency is a variable of many things. One is X minus M, export minus imports. The other one is capital inflow and capital outflow. Remittances comes in the capital as an issue of net capital inflow. So when you project that the remittances will go up, definitely that means you are getting foreign currencies inside the country. When you get more inflow of external or foreign currencies inside the country, what that means is that then that foreign currency depreciates against the domestic one. And that is the kind of analysis we actually also do when we are dealing with interest rates. Maybe as I summarize, and I'm not speaking for central bank. When we see central bank, for example, recently raised the benchmark rate, it's not because they are against the borrowers. It is because you have to manage parameters. One of the critical parameters in the economy is inflation. Because inflation affects expenditure, it affects consumption, it directly affects how much a Kenyan can actually consume. And when the central bank raises rates, what they are trying to do is, number one, to manage inflation, but also number two, to make Kenya a good destination for capital inflow. When you want to invest money, you look at the rates. If the rates in Kenya are so low, comparative to the global rates, then you expect capital outflow, because people are going where they could fetch higher interest rates. And that is the reason why you take it up, you attract capital inflows, You deal with the currency, and at the same time you are dealing with inflation.
I think just
Last
clarity.
yes.
Clarity. What then is the true value of the Kenyan shilling? We have seen it, for the past few weeks it has been going down. Will it continue going so from your projections as an economist? What exactly should we be telling a lot of the importers in the country?
That's a good question. The true price of tea in this hotel is the price I would pay for tea now. The real price of fare from Syokimau to Nairobi is the real fare you pay now. So the true value of the shilling now is the true value of the shilling now. And therefore, the projection is based on what is likely to happen. The current shilling is around 1.146 or thereabout. In my estimation, the shilling may gain further. And it's based on a few things. One, we are doing very well in agriculture. That diminishes our X minus M because our imports become lower. We are increasing our exports in terms of our cash crops and the rest. So X minus M generally becomes higher. Two, the rise of interest rates makes Kenya more preferred for capital inflows. That is a very huge plus. And lastly, the fact that we are seeing inflation figures going down in the US and the UK means that the Kenyans living there will have more disposable income, and therefore they'll have more to send home, and therefore they'll increase remittances, and increased remittances strengthen the shilling.
Also, just to answer my question, on the missed revenue targets by the taxman, you haven't touched on it. And also, in other words, are you rejecting the BPS that, of course, talks about the 377 billion to be borrowed locally?
Joel, I thought I answered, but let's say also hear the view of the Vice Chair.
Let me just add on to what he said on the missed revenue. You say that may increase the deficit and therefore automatically means more borrowing or more loans. I want to say that if you watched keenly on all our supplementary budgets, the government has applied austerity measures. There are cuts across board on those budgets. So what are we trying to do? To minimize the deficit so that there is no more borrowing. So in the event that the KRA is not able to meet, one of the options that government may undertake is we reduce our estimates. We make cuts on our budgets, among other interventions. Thank you.
I just simplify a bit.
Yes, we have the Vice Chair of the Debt Committee actually.
Is here, but
Also the member of this committee.
But let me just say this: we are not rejecting budget policy statement. We are here working on a budget policy statement, and that's why next week we'll be also meeting Treasury to also discuss and agree on very many parameters. So what is before Parliament is what now we're discussing today. So we're not at the point of whether rejecting or approving. We are working on that document.
Yeah, that is the Honorable Makali, the Vice Chair.
Let me just make this thing that is simpler for you, those who are an economist. Deficit is equal to revenue minus expenditure. So when expenditure is higher than revenue, you have a negative figure, and that's the deficit. So for example, when what Church has asked, the issue of the ratios, the public debt mix, which is, when you look at the medium-term debt strategy, the optimal mix is 45 domestic borrowing, 55 external borrowing. When you look at the BPS, which has been discussed by the Budget and Appropriations Committee, the proposed mix is 48 external, 46 external, 54 domestic. So they are interchanged. So as a committee, because we have 3 committees involved here, we have the Finance and Planning Committee, which looks at revenue, We have budget and appropriation, which mostly looks at expenditure, and we have public debt and privatization, which looks at the deficit. So, at one point, these three committees must sit down and agree as a house which deficit are we going to approve. But Treasury, in their own words, and based on that scientific analysis, they have said the best public debt mix is 45% domestic, 55% external. And then this has implications. When you have higher domestic borrowing, you have what we call the interest risk coming into play. When you have a higher external borrowing, you have the exchange rate risk coming into play. So we need a very good delicate balancing. And that's why we are saying these committees, the three committees, will have at one point to sit and agree which deficit will be pushing or approving as a house for Kenyans. But we have been having a challenge, and that's what the chair was saying in the chair budget. When you look at the start of this financial year, Parliament approved a deficit of 4.4%. After about 2 months, it was revised upwards by the executive to about 5.8. It will go to about 5.8. After another 2 months, it has now been revised downwards to 5.5. So as we are discussing now, the current deficit as approved in our books through the supplementary budget was 5.5. And I think really what we are saying is, as you can see, these three committees each has a role. The budget committee will think more of the expenditure. As public debt and privatization thinking more about the deficit, finance will think more about revenue generation. So if the projected revenue collection is overestimated and you don't hit the targets, then it means the proposed expenditure will not be funded. So you increase the deficit, which means you increase public borrowing. So it's a more complex matter, and we must get it right. That's what we are saying. For me, from where I see it, I think what we need is a very sober discussion between these three committees, so that we help Kenyans get out of this public debt. We have said borrowing, we cannot avoid it so long as revenue minus expenditure is negative. But then you need to manage this borrowing so that you get the best mix in terms of borrowing by minimizing the cost of borrowing and minimizing the risks associated with borrowing. If you get that right, we are on track. And that is now the challenge we have as members of Parliament, so that we achieve that procedure. But at the end of the day, Kenyans out there, any Kenyan, including my mother, what they want is money in the pocket to buy sugar, to buy salt, to buy. They don't care about these jargons we are using here. Thank you, God bless you.
Yes, sir. Yes,
If you permit, we can release other members will be back here. Members will be back here at 2:50. I requested those people who speak language that Nyoro understands to remain. They are requesting Mr. Sheriff, please come. They are requesting we do it, and it's good that we give them that chance.
What we don't want to know in Europe.
Well, we are good. I think you are one of us through other means.
No, tomorrow. In customs.
Yeah.